Viggo was 68, a retired carpenter with strong hands that had once built homes and furniture for half the town. These days, those same hands trembled when he tried to hold his morning cup of tea, and the stairs that he used to climb in a single bound now left him short of breath. One morning, as he bent down to tie his shoes, a strange tightness spread across his chest. It wasn't sharp, but heavy, as though someone had quietly placed a weight on him. He brushed it off, telling his wife it was probably just indigestion, but in the back of his mind, a whisper of fear began to take root. A few weeks later, that whisper grew louder. Viggo found himself struggling just to walk across the garden. His legs felt weak, his heart pounded too quickly, and the color in his face seemed to fade more with each passing day. Finally, at his daughter's insistence, he went to see the doctor. After a round of tests, the truth was laid out with quiet seriousness. His arteries were narrowing, blood was no longer flowing the way it should, and the risk of a heart attack or stroke was very real. Viggo sat there in silence, staring at his calloused hands, suddenly aware that the strength he had always taken for granted was slipping away. Now, my dear friends, imagine the weight of those words landing on someone who has always prided himself on being strong. Viggo thought about his grandchildren waiting at home, their little voices calling, "Grandpa, Grandpa," whenever he came through the door. He thought about his wife, who still liked to hold his hand on their evening walks. And for the first time, he wondered whether he would be there for the milestones still to come. The birthdays, the graduations, the simple joys of family dinners around the table. That kind of fear doesn't just live in the body, it takes root in the heart. But here's where his story began to shift. Instead of surrendering to the diagnosis, Viggo listened carefully to what his doctor told him. That change was still possible, that every small step he took could help open the flow of life back into his veins. It wasn't about pills alone, or about treatments that felt far away and out of reach. It was about the little things he chose each day, the glass of something nourishing he poured in the morning, the calming tea he held at night. These were not just drinks, but small lifelines, ways to tell his body and his heart, "I still want to live." Viggo began his journey slowly, almost cautiously, as if he wasn't sure his body would believe him. A ruby red juice here, a fragrant tea there, a simple homemade tonic that reminded him of his grandmother's remedies. And with each sip, he started to feel the faint stirrings of renewal, steadier hands, easier breaths, nights of deeper rest. No miracle, no instant cure, but a quiet transformation, one choice at a time. His fear began to soften, replaced by a fragile but growing hope that maybe, just maybe, his heart still had many years of love left to give. And that, my friends, is the story I want to share with you today, not of despair, but of possibility. Viggo's journey is not his alone. It belongs to anyone who has felt the shadow of illness looming over their days. Because while arteries may grow quiet and narrow, they are still listening. And what you choose to pour into your body can be the difference between fading too soon and living long enough to see the smiles of those you love. Viggo sat on the edge of his bed one gray morning, staring at the carpet as though the patterns in it might give him an answer he didn't want to face. His wife had already gone downstairs to make breakfast, the clatter of dishes drifting faintly up the staircase. He rubbed his chest absent-mindedly, feeling again the dull, unsettling weight that had been visiting him more often these past few months. It wasn't pain exactly, but it was enough to unsettle him, enough to make him wonder if he should finally stop pretending everything was fine. For a man who had spent his life working with his hands, crafting wood into something useful and lasting, the idea that his own body might be betraying him felt unbearable. The day he finally went to see the doctor wasn't dramatic. No collapse, no flashing lights. Just his daughter's gentle insistence that her father should get checked, just in case. In the sterile quiet of the clinic, Viggo sat with his arms folded, trying to look calm while the doctor explained the situation. His arteries, she said, were narrowing. The blood that should move smoothly through his body was meeting silent roadblocks, and if left unchecked, it could lead to a heart attack or stroke. The words felt like nails being driven slowly into wood, precise and final. Viggo listened, nodding, but inside, something trembled. That evening, when he returned home, the weight of the diagnosis pressed heavier than the tightness in his chest ever had. His grandchildren ran to him as they always did, wrapping their small arms around his legs, their laughter filling the room. He forced a smile, kissed the tops of their heads, but his mind kept replaying the doctor's warning. He had always been strong, building houses, climbing ladders, hoisting beams. But now, at 68, he wondered if strength was slipping away, if time was shortening in ways he hadn't prepared for. His wife noticed his quietness at dinner. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. "Tell me," she whispered, her eyes searching his. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat, but finally he told her the truth. Her face softened, not with fear, but with the steady calm she had always carried. "Then we fight it," she said simply, and somehow those 3 words felt like a lantern lit in a dark room. The next morning, Viggo woke before dawn, unable to sleep. He sat by the kitchen window with a cup of warm water and lemon, something his doctor had suggested might help his digestion and circulation. The tartness surprised him, waking his senses, and though it wasn't much, it felt like a beginning. He thought about how something so small, so ordinary, could carry the weight of hope. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He wanted to see his grandchildren grow taller, wanted to keep walking hand in hand with his wife, wanted to keep building, even if it was only birdhouses now instead of houses. As the first light of morning touched the garden, Viggo felt a quiet shift inside. Not a miracle, not a cure, but a whisper of determination. If his body had grown silent in its warnings, then he would learn to listen in other ways. He would start with the little things, a drink of lemon water at sunrise, a walk around the yard, a choice to turn away from the sweetened teas he once enjoyed. Each step would be small, but each would be his. And for the first time in months, he felt not the weight of fear, but the faint stirring of courage. This was only the beginning, of course. The road ahead would be long, filled with choices he had never thought much about before. But as he sat there with the taste of lemon lingering on his tongue, he understood something vital. That change didn't come all at once, but quietly, like morning light easing over the horizon. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A week after his doctor's visit, Viggo found himself standing in the small local market, a basket dangling from his arm. He wasn't there for anything in particular, just a few vegetables and bread, but his eyes kept drifting toward the rows of bright bottles and cartons that lined the refrigerated shelves. His doctor's words still rang in his ears, "Your arteries are narrowing," and though he had started his mornings with warm lemon water, he felt he needed more. Something tangible, something he could hold in his hand and say, "This is me fighting back." That's when he noticed it, a small bottle of deep ruby red liquid, almost glowing under the fluorescent light. Pomegranate juice, the label read. He had heard of it before, but never thought much of it. Still, something about the richness of its color drew him in. It looked alive, vibrant, as though it carried the very energy he was searching for. He hesitated, reading the fine print, making sure there wasn't added sugar. For years, he had grabbed sodas without a second thought. Now, every choice felt like a weighty decision, the kind that might add or take away days from his life. That evening, back at home, Viggo poured the juice into a small glass. His wife raised her eyebrows, curious. "That's new," she said with a soft smile. He nodded, lifting the glass slowly, almost ceremoniously, as if it were more than just a drink. The taste startled him, sharp and tart, with a sweetness that lingered. It wasn't easy at first, but as he swallowed, he felt as though something strong was moving through him, washing over the heaviness in his chest. It was only a feeling, perhaps even imagined, but he clung to it. Over the next few days, drinking that ruby red juice became a quiet ritual. Each morning after his lemon water, he'd pour a small glass, sit by the window, and let the sun catch the liquid, glowing like a jewel. His grandchildren began to notice too. "What's that, Grandpa?" they asked, their eyes wide. Viggo chuckled, holding the glass up. "It's my magic potion," he teased, and they giggled, pretending to be wizards and knights. But when the laughter faded, he thought to himself, maybe it really was a kind of potion, not magical, but life-giving. One afternoon, his daughter came by and found him sipping the juice slowly. She leaned on the counter, her voice soft but firm. "Dad, you look different," she said. He looked up, surprised. "Different?" She nodded. "Calmer, stronger even." He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this small change could ripple through his body, widening his veins, easing the silent strain on his heart. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faint stirrings of control returning to his life. But the truth was, it wasn't just the juice, it was the act of choosing, of saying yes to something his body needed instead of no to what it didn't. Each sip reminded him that healing wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was slow, steady, and quiet, like wood shavings falling from a plane, smoothing rough edges bit by bit. And though Viggo never told anyone, sometimes in the stillness of morning, he would close his eyes and imagine the juice moving through his arteries, washing them clean, carrying away the years of neglect. Whether or not it was true didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was the hope it carried, and the way hope itself seemed to lighten the weight on his chest. That hope, fragile as it was, began to change him, not only in what he drank, but in how he thought about his days. The heavy shadow of fear that had followed him since the doctor's office was beginning to lift, replaced by something softer, something almost like courage. And it all started with a glass of red, alive in his hand, reminding him that life, too, could still be vibrant. The days grew warmer, and Viggo found himself sitting on the back porch more often, letting the breeze move across his face as he watched the garden sway in the afternoon light. The ruby-red juice had become a steady companion, but one morning as he shuffled through the market again, he noticed another simple treasure tucked away between rows of boxes: green tea. Not the bottled kind he had seen his grandchildren grab, sweetened and bright with marketing colors, but a small package of loose leaves wrapped in paper, smelling faintly of earth and grass. Something about the simplicity of it appealed to him. He remembered his own mother brewing tea when he was a boy, steam curling up from the chipped kettle, the warmth filling their small kitchen. She had always said tea could settle the nerves, clear the mind. Viggo wondered if perhaps it could settle his racing heart, too. That evening, he bought a small teapot, something he hadn't owned in years, and placed it on the stove with care. When the water finally warmed and the leaves unfolded, he poured himself a cup and sat quietly at the table, watching the steam rise like a soft ghost. The first sip was bitter, sharper than he had expected, but there was something calming in its simplicity. No sugar, no fizz, just warmth spreading through him, slowing his breath. His wife joined him, curious, wrapping her hands around the second cup he offered her. Together they sat without words, only the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway and the gentle hum of evening settling in. For a man who had always filled his days with hammering, sawing, and building, this silence felt new, strange but oddly comforting. Over the next week, Viggo made it a ritual, 2, sometimes 3 cups a day. In the mornings after his lemon water, in the afternoons when the fatigue threatened to pull him down, and in the evenings when his thoughts grew restless. It wasn't just a drink, it was a pause, a chance to sit still, to notice his breath and the beating of his heart. His grandchildren teased him, calling him Grandpa the Tea Master, but they also started to sit beside him sometimes, dipping biscuits into their own cups of warm milk as though they were part of the ceremony. One afternoon, his daughter visited and noticed the teapot steaming quietly on the stove. She sat across from him, listening as he explained the new habit. "It helps me slow down," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. "I used to think rest was wasted time, but maybe it's what I needed all along." She reached across, resting her hand on his. "Dad, slowing down doesn't mean you're giving up. It means you're giving yourself more time." Her words settled in him like the tea itself, gentle but deeply warming. In truth, the green tea began to change more than just his afternoons. He noticed he no longer reached for the sugary bottled drinks he once kept in the fridge. The bitterness of tea made sweetness less appealing, and he found himself craving simpler tastes. Even his sleep began to shift, less tossing and turning, fewer nights staring at the ceiling. He felt steadier, like a boat finding calmer waters after weeks of drifting in storms. One evening, as Viggo sat on the porch with his tea, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, he realized something he hadn't felt in months: gratitude. Gratitude not for big things, but for the small rituals, the tiny choices that seemed to stitch hope back into his days. A glass of juice, a cup of tea, moments that whispered, "You're still here, you're still living, and your heart still has time." The first time Viggo noticed beetroot piled high at the market, he nearly walked past it. The deep purple roots looked rough, still carrying traces of dirt, their color too intense to be inviting. He had never cared much for them, except as the occasional pickle at a family gathering. But something in him paused. Perhaps it was the memory of his doctor's words, or perhaps it was the thought that life itself was hiding in colors that bold. Either way, he picked up a bundle, surprised by the weight of it in his hands. That evening, his wife helped him wash and peel the beets, their juice staining their fingers crimson. She laughed as she noticed the color spreading across her palms. "It looks like we've been painting," she said, and for the first time in a while, Viggo laughed with her. Together, they fed the chunks into the juicer, the machine groaning until a glass filled with a liquid so dark it almost glowed. Viggo lifted it carefully, studying the way it caught the light. It seemed powerful, almost intimidating. The taste was earthy, stronger than anything he was used to, and he nearly set the glass down after the first sip. But then something curious happened. Within an hour, he felt different, lighter somehow, as though a breeze had moved through him, sweeping away some of the heaviness. His hands didn't tremble as much that evening, and when he climbed the stairs to bed, the effort felt less like climbing a hill and more like walking on level ground. It startled him, this sudden shift, and though he told himself it could just be in his mind, the change was enough to make him curious for more. In the days that followed, beetroot juice became another part of his new rhythm. A small glass in the morning, sometimes on an empty stomach, though he laughed at himself when he noticed the harmless blush it left in his urine later. He told no one at first, feeling almost foolish, but he couldn't deny how different he felt. His legs carried him more easily on his walks through the garden. His breaths came steadier, and even the chill that sometimes crept into his hands seemed to soften. One afternoon, his grandson begged him to play catch in the yard. Normally, Viggo would have hesitated, offering an excuse about being tired. But that day, he found himself reaching for the old baseball glove without thinking. They tossed the ball back and forth, the boys' laughter filling the air, and Viggo felt a strength stirring in his arms he thought he had lost. When they finally sat down on the steps, cheeks flushed, his grandson leaned against him, whispering, "Grandpa, you're strong again." The words lodged in his chest like a gift he hadn't expected. Of course, not every day was perfect. Some mornings he still woke with heaviness, some evenings his energy faded quickly. But now he had moments, bright, undeniable moments that reminded him his body still held possibility. He began to see the drinks not as cures, but as companions, each offering its own kind of support. The beetroot, bold and unyielding, gave him back not just a sense of circulation, but a taste of vitality he feared was gone forever. One evening, his wife found him standing by the sink, holding his empty glass, staring out the window at the fading light. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. He turned to her, smiling in that quiet way he had. "I'm thinking I still have time," he said. "And I don't want to waste it." She wrapped her arms around him, and together they stood, the purple stains on their fingers still lingering, a reminder of the simple choices that were carrying him forward. The first time Viggo tasted hibiscus tea, it was almost by accident. His wife had brought home a small bag of dried crimson petals from the herbal stall at the market, curious about the vendor's claim that it was good for the heart. The petals looked fragile, almost like bits of paper-thin velvet, and when she poured hot water over them, the color bled out in a swirl of red, so vivid it reminded Viggo of stained glass in an old chapel. The kitchen filled with a faint floral scent, tangy and sweet at once, and he found himself leaning in, curious. When he lifted the cup to his lips, the tartness caught him off guard, sharper than the green tea he had grown used to, yet refreshing in its own way. He closed his eyes as he swallowed, and for a moment it felt as though the tightness in his chest softened. He didn't say anything aloud, not wanting to raise expectations, but something about the drink seemed to reach into him differently, as if its warmth carried not just flavor, but comfort. That night, for the first time in weeks, he drifted to sleep without hours of restless turning. The next evening, his wife made it again. They sat together by the window, cups in hand, the children's laughter echoing faintly from the yard outside. Viggo watched the red liquid shimmer in the lamplight and thought about how strange it was that such simple things could carry such weight. No machines, no pills, no hospital rooms, just petals steeped in water, reminding his body to slow down, to ease the pressure that had been building silently inside him. Over time, hibiscus tea became their evening ritual. Some nights, when the air was warm, they drank it iced, condensation dripping down the glasses as they watched the fireflies blink in the garden. Other nights, when the house was quiet and cool, they drank it hot, letting the steam curl around their faces as they spoke softly about the past and the future. For Viggo, those moments began to feel like medicine of another kind, not just for his arteries, but for his soul. His daughter noticed the change when she visited one weekend. She saw the calm in his expression, the way he seemed less hurried, less restless. "You look lighter, Dad," she said, tilting her head as though trying to read a secret. Viggo smiled, holding up his cup. "Maybe it's this," he said. She laughed, but her eyes softened with relief. She had been carrying her own quiet worry, and seeing her father calmer gave her peace as well. One night, as Viggo sat with his tea, his grandson crawled onto his lap and asked, "Why do you drink this red juice every night?" Viggo chuckled, pressing a kiss to the boy's hair. "Because it helps my heart rest," he said gently. The boy thought for a moment, then nodded with the solemn wisdom children sometimes carry. "Then keep drinking it, Grandpa. I want your heart to stay." Those words stayed with Viggo long after the boy had fallen asleep upstairs. The truth was, he could feel the difference. His blood pressure readings weren't as daunting, his head didn't pound as often, and his nights were no longer haunted by sleepless hours. The hibiscus tea was doing its quiet work, but more than that, it was giving him a new way of being, slower, gentler, more present. Each sip reminded him that healing wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as sitting still, holding something warm, and choosing peace over fear. And so the crimson tea became more than a drink. It was a bridge between the fear of what might come and the hope of what still could be. It was the sound of laughter in the kitchen, the touch of his wife's hand across the table, the steady reminder that even in the face of illness, life could still be savored, one sip at a time. On a cool morning in early autumn, Viggo wandered through the market with his basket, the air filled with the smell of fresh bread and ripe fruit. He stopped at a stall where small glass bottles lined the table, their liquid dark and almost jewel-like. The handwritten label read cranberry juice, unsweetened. He picked one up, turning it in his hands. The vendor, a cheerful woman with silver hair, smiled knowingly. "It's sharp," she warned, "but it does the heart good." Viggo nodded, slipping it into his basket, unsure of what to expect, but curious all the same. That evening, after dinner, he poured a small glass. The liquid gleamed dark red, not as rich as the pomegranate, not as floral as the hibiscus, but with a quiet strength of its own. He took a cautious sip, and his mouth puckered instantly. The tartness was almost overwhelming, cutting through his tongue with a brightness that startled him. His wife laughed at the look on his face, taking her own sip and shaking her head. "That one's bold," she said, setting the glass down. Viggo chuckled, but he kept drinking, feeling the sharpness clear a path through him, like wind pushing through a narrow canyon. The flavor awakened something old in him, a memory of his boyhood days when he and his brothers would wander the forest, plucking wild berries from thorny bushes, their faces scrunched at the sourness, but their hearts wild with laughter. He could almost hear their voices echoing through the trees, could almost see his mother's gentle scolding when they returned home with purple-stained fingers. That memory made him smile, and for the first time, the tartness of the cranberry felt less like a challenge and more like a reminder of vitality, of the days when his legs carried him far and his heart never faltered. In the weeks that followed, Viggo made a habit of it. Not every night, not every day, but often enough that he began to notice small changes. His digestion felt smoother, his chest less heavy after meals. Even his mood seemed sharper, clearer, as though the tang of the cranberry had swept cobwebs from the corners of his mind. When his daughter came by one evening, she wrinkled her nose at the glass in his hand. "Dad, that looks strong." Viggo grinned, lifting it toward her. "It keeps me strong," he replied. She smiled, a little sadly, as though relieved to see him trying so hard. One afternoon, he decided to mix the juice with a handful of oats and berries in the blender, curious about making it more palatable. The result was surprisingly good, a creamy, tangy smoothie that even his grandson approved of. "Grandpa, this is better than ice cream," the boy exclaimed, his lips stained red. Viggo laughed, a deep laugh that rumbled through him, and for a moment he forgot entirely about sickness, about arteries, about time. There was only sweetness in that moment, not from sugar, but from the joy of sharing something with those he loved. As the days passed, cranberry juice became less about fighting illness and more about connection. Sometimes he drank it alone, sitting quietly in the kitchen, savoring its bite as though it were chiseling away at the fear still lodged in his chest. Other times he shared it, blending it into smoothies for his grandchildren or pouring a small glass for his wife, both of them laughing at the face she still made at its sharpness. In those moments, the juice became more than nourishment. It became a thread tying him back to his family, to his past, to the boy who once ran through forests with stained fingers. And though Viggo knew no single drink could change the course of everything, he also knew each choice mattered. Each glass was a statement, a whisper to his body. "I am still here. I am still trying." And with every sip of that tart, stubborn drink, he felt more certain that his story wasn't over yet, that he still had chapters left to live and loved ones left to see grow. It was his wife who suggested the tonic first. She had read about it in an old health magazine, a mixture of garlic, lemon, and honey, simple but powerful. At first, Viggo wrinkled his nose at the thought. Garlic, he believed, belonged in stews and roasts, not in a glass he was expected to drink. But she insisted, placing the ingredients on the counter one quiet morning. "Try it once," she said with a soft firmness that left little room for refusal. He peeled the garlic slowly, the sharp scent clinging to his fingertips, filling the kitchen with its pungent presence. He crushed a clove, releasing its oils, and mixed it with the juice of half a lemon and a spoonful of honey. As the warm water swirled everything together, the steam rose with a fragrance that was both sharp and soothing. Viggo hesitated with the cup in his hand, his face twisted with doubt. His wife stood across from him, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised in gentle challenge. With a sigh, he lifted it to his lips. The taste was a battle. Fiery garlic colliding with the sour sting of lemon, softened only slightly by the honey's sweetness. His throat burned as he swallowed, and he coughed, laughing in disbelief. "You're trying to kill me," he teased, his eyes watering. His wife only smiled, handing him a slice of bread as if to soften the experience. Yet even as the taste lingered, something inside him stirred. A warmth, a rush, a sense that the drink was doing something, even if only reminding him he was alive. Over the following days, the tonic became a strange kind of ritual. Each morning, he would crush the garlic with the flat of his knife, the sound sharp against the cutting board. Each squeeze of lemon reminded him of the brightness still hidden in simple things. And each swirl of honey brought balance, a reminder that even bitterness could be softened with a touch of sweetness. Slowly, he began to crave it, not for the taste, which never grew easier, but for the feeling it gave him afterward. His chest felt lighter, his breath deeper, as though the drink was carving new space inside him. One afternoon, his daughter caught him preparing it and laughed at the sight. "Dad, you'll scare off everyone within a mile with that smell." Viggo chuckled, raising the glass. "If it keeps me around longer, I'll risk the smell." She grew quiet then, watching him sip, and when he lowered the glass, her eyes shone with something more than amusement. It was relief. He realized in that moment that this ritual wasn't just for him. It was for them, for the family who wanted him to stay. Even his grandchildren grew curious. "Why do you drink that, Grandpa?" his grandson asked one morning, wrinkling his nose at the scent. Viggo smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Because sometimes the strongest medicine doesn't taste sweet," he said gently, "but it helps me stay strong enough to play with you." The boy nodded solemnly, as though he understood more than his years allowed. There were mornings when Viggo still dreaded the sharp burn of the tonic, when the thought of it made him want to push it aside. But each time he reminded himself of the deeper truth, that healing wasn't always comfortable. Sometimes it asked for sacrifice, for facing discomfort head on. And in those moments, the tonic became more than a drink. It became a lesson that strength isn't just built in ease, but in the willingness to endure what is difficult for the sake of what is worth living for. By the end of the month, Viggo had grown oddly proud of his ritual. The smell of garlic clinging to his hands, the sting of lemon, the golden swirl of honey, they had become symbols of his determination. And when he stood at the sink, rinsing his cup, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. That he was, in his own quiet way, fighting back. It was a restless evening when Viggo first tried what his wife called golden milk. The house was quiet, the grandchildren long asleep, and yet his mind refused to follow. He lay in bed listening to the rhythm of his own heartbeat, too aware of the heaviness in his chest, too aware of time. Finally, he rose, padding softly to the kitchen where the faint glow of the stove light waited. His wife was already there, as though she had read his mind. "Sit," she said, pulling out a chair. "I'll make something for you." He watched her warm a small pot of milk. Oat milk, she explained, gentle and unsweetened. Into it, she stirred a half spoon of golden powder, the turmeric bright as sunrise against the pale milk. She added a pinch of black pepper, a swirl of honey, and soon the kitchen filled with a fragrance that was earthy, warm, and comforting. Viggo inhaled deeply, his shoulders easing before he had even taken a sip. When she placed the cup before him, the liquid glowed like a lantern in the dim light, and for a moment he felt as though he were holding something sacred. The first taste was unlike anything else, spiced, warm, carrying a hint of sweetness. It spread through him slowly, wrapping him in comfort that seemed to reach places even his fears couldn't touch. By the time he drained the last drop, his body felt heavier in the right way, like it was ready to sink into rest. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept through until morning. waking not with a jolt of worry, but with a quiet sense of being renewed. The nights that followed carried the same ritual. After dinner, when the dishes were cleared and the children tucked into bed, Viggo and his wife would share their golden cups in the silence of the kitchen. They spoke softly about the past, of the house he had built with his own hands, of the summers when they were young and the days felt endless. They spoke of the future, too, daring to imagine that there might still be many mornings ahead, many more evenings filled with warmth and laughter. The golden milk was more than a drink. It was a pause, a pocket of time carved out just for them, where illness had no claim. One evening, his daughter dropped by and found them with their glowing cups. She laughed gently, calling it their potion hour. But then she noticed the calm in her father's eyes, the way his shoulders rested more easily. "You look softer, Dad," she said, almost surprised. Viggo smiled, taking another sip. "Maybe I finally learned how to rest." The words hung in the air, and he realized they were true. He had always fought his body, forcing it to endure long hours of work, pushing it harder than it could manage. Now he was learning that healing sometimes meant surrender, not giving up, but giving in to peace. The grandchildren grew curious as well. One night, his granddaughter tiptoed into the kitchen, her eyes wide as she peered at the golden drink. "It looks like sunshine," she whispered. Viggo chuckled, pulling her onto his lap. "It feels like it too," he said, letting her sip from his cup. She wrinkled her nose at the spice, but her giggles filled the room, and he thought about how sweet it was to share even these small rituals with them. Slowly, the golden milk began to weave itself into his healing. It wasn't just about rest, it was about recovery, about giving his body time to repair, about telling himself that not every battle needed to be fought in daylight. Some battles were won in sleep, in stillness, in warmth. And each evening, as he set down his empty cup, Viggo felt the quiet promise of another day waiting for him, strong and steady. The mornings were growing colder, frost beginning to lace the edges of the garden when Viggo decided to try something new. He had read about oats and berries being good for the heart, and one morning, as he stood in the kitchen, he found himself gathering what he needed: a handful of rolled oats, a scoop of frozen blueberries, a few raspberries, and a splash of almond milk his wife had picked up for baking. The blender whirred loudly, filling the kitchen with its steady hum until a thick, purple drink poured into his glass. At first, he wasn't sure what to expect. The smoothie was creamy, flecked with tiny seeds, the color bright as wildflowers. He raised the glass to his lips and took a cautious sip. It was tart and sweet, earthy and cool, and it settled in his stomach with a heaviness that felt comforting. For years, Viggo had skipped breakfast or filled it with bread and strong coffee, rushing through the morning as if the day demanded speed. But now, sitting at the table with his glass, he felt something different, like he was fueling himself, not just filling himself. His wife joined him soon after, curious. She poured her own glass and smiled as she tasted it. "This feels alive," she said, surprised. Viggo nodded, watching the color stain the sides of the glass like paint. He realized then that this drink wasn't just food, it was a reminder of something simple and nourishing, something he had been missing. The berries carried the taste of summer, the oats gave a weight that grounded him, and together they made him feel cared for, as if the very act of blending them was a gesture of love. The grandchildren noticed too. One morning they rushed into the kitchen as the blender roared, giggling as the lid rattled. "What are you making, Grandpa?" they shouted over the noise. Viggo grinned, pouring the smoothie into 3 smaller cups. "Breakfast you can drink," he told them. Their faces lit up, purple mustaches forming as they slurped greedily, laughing with the kind of abandon that only children can. In that moment, Viggo felt something stir deep inside, a joy he hadn't tasted in years. But it wasn't just joy, it was also strength. Over the next few weeks, he noticed he didn't feel the same heaviness after meals. His walks through the garden grew longer, his legs less tired. He found himself humming as he worked in his small shed, the rhythm of old carpentry tools coming back to him like forgotten music. The smoothie, simple as it was, had become part of his rhythm, an anchor in the morning, a promise to himself that he was still choosing life. One evening, as he sat with his daughter on the porch, she asked quietly, "Dad, do you really think these changes make a difference?" Viggo paused, watching the fading light across the fields. "I don't know if they'll fix everything," he admitted, "but they make me feel like I'm still steering the ship, and that's enough." She looked at him, her eyes soft with both worry and pride, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like she wasn't just seeing her father grow older. She was seeing him fight to stay. The oats and berries, humble as they were, became more than breakfast. They became proof that healing could be found in the ordinary, in the small acts of care we often overlook. For Viggo, every glass was not just nourishment, but a quiet declaration. I am still here, I am still strong, I am still choosing to stay. And as the winter crept closer, with long nights and short days, he held on to that ritual, the purple drink bright against the gray mornings, reminding him that strength could be built one sip at a time. The first time Viggo prepared chia seed water, he wasn't sure what to make of it. The seeds looked tiny and lifeless, scattered across the palm of his hand like bits of gravel. His wife had read about them and insisted they were worth trying. Just let them sit, she said, pouring the spoonful into a tall glass of water. Viggo frowned, unconvinced, but he watched as the seeds slowly began to change, softening, swelling, turning the clear water into something almost otherworldly. Within half an hour, the glass held not just water, but a strange, gel-like mixture that shimmered in the sunlight. When he finally lifted the glass and drank, the texture startled him. The seeds slid across his tongue like tiny pearls, the lemon squeezed in, making the taste sharper, brighter. He wasn't sure he liked it, not at first, but as the glass emptied, he realized it left him fuller than he expected, a quiet satisfaction lingering in his stomach. For a man who often craved bread or sweet snacks in the afternoon, this strange drink seemed to settle those urges. It wasn't indulgent, but it was grounding, like his body was saying thank you in its own silent way. Over the next week, Viggo found himself returning to it. Some afternoons, when his hands trembled or his energy dipped, he would prepare the seeds early, letting them soak while he worked in the shed or walked slowly through the garden. By the time he returned, the water had transformed, waiting for him patiently. That patience itself became part of the ritual. It taught him that not everything had to be immediate. Healing, like chia seeds, sometimes needed time to unfold. His grandchildren were fascinated. "It looks like frog eggs," one of them exclaimed, peering into the glass with wide eyes. Viggo laughed, nodding. "Maybe so, but these little things are stronger than they look." They wrinkled their noses but begged to try, giggling when the seeds tickled their tongues. For Viggo, their laughter was reason enough to keep the ritual alive. The drink might have been strange, but it became a moment of wonder, a way to show his grandchildren that even the smallest things could carry strength. One evening, his daughter asked him how he managed to stick to all these new habits. Viggo thought for a moment before answering. "Because each one reminds me I still have a choice," he said softly. "Every glass, every sip, it's me saying I want to stay a little longer." She grew quiet at his words, her eyes filling with tears she quickly brushed away. In that moment, Viggo realized the choices he made weren't just for him. They were for his family, for the people who wanted his presence more than anything else. Over time, chia water became more than hydration. It became a lesson in patience, in slowing down, in allowing life to transform in its own time. The seeds, small and unremarkable at first glance, reminded him of himself. Aging, worn, perhaps overlooked, yet still capable of softening, expanding, and nourishing when given the chance. Each glass became a mirror of that truth, a quiet assurance that change could come gently, without fanfare, but powerfully all the same. And so Viggo embraced the ritual. On afternoons when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the yard, he would sit with his glass of chia water, the lemon's brightness lingering on his lips. It was not the bold rush of beetroot or the sharp bite of cranberry, but something humbler, steadier. And in that steadiness, Viggo found comfort, the kind that whispered not of battles fought, but of balance kept, of life lived with patience and care. Viggo's story was never about chasing miracles. It was about the quiet choices he made, one sip at a time. From the tart bite of cranberry juice that brought back childhood memories, to the golden warmth of turmeric milk that helped him sleep through the night, his life began to shift in ways that surprised even him. The heaviness in his chest grew lighter, his steps steadier, his nights calmer. More than that, he began to feel present again, alive in the small moments with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren. These changes weren't grand or dramatic. They were woven into ordinary days: morning lemon water, an evening cup of hibiscus tea, a glass of beet juice before walking through the garden. But together, they formed a rhythm of healing, a quiet rebellion against fear. Viggo discovered that the strength of the heart is not only measured by beats and numbers, but by the choices we make to care for it, again and again. And so, my dear friends, perhaps Viggo's journey is also a gentle reminder for us. The path to better health does not begin with a single leap, but with the first step we take toward change. It might be choosing water over soda, a handful of berries over a sweet dessert, or simply pausing long enough to breathe, to rest, to listen to what the body is asking for. Because in the end, what saved Viggo was not just the drinks he poured, but the hope he chose to hold. And that same hope is waiting for each of us too, quiet, steady, and ready to carry us toward more mornings, more laughter, and more years with the people we love. Your heart is still listening. What will you choose to give it today?